All right, so the first thing that I want to talk about is AWS itself. In particular, we're going to talk about AWS has a lot of services that you could end up using. Anything you could sort of imagine doing from a development perspective, AWS has, whether it's hosting applications, whether it's doing things with files, whether it's scaling things out. There's computing, all kinds of things that you have on AWS. One of the most common services that AWS has is something called S3, where in essence, what this is a cloud storage for data. So theoretically, you could use S3 if you have files that you wanted to save somewhere. You could save them up on S3 and you could end up accessing them. You can end up uploading them through S3, and you can it could just be a place that you end up storing files without even talking about application development. From an application perspective, it's very common to use S3 for static resources in your application. Why? Well, S3 also, not only is it a cloud storage, but it's very fast cloud storage, so that you can end up putting things in S3 into geographical regions. And one of the things you can end up doing is that if it's really critical to get resources in an application to clients, you have some control over where those resources are. So S3 will act in that case as a CDN, right? Which is a content delivery network. Where else can you end up using it in applications? Well, if you had users that were uploading data somewhere and you wanted to save that data as files, and we've seen that, we can end up uploading, users might end up uploading images, they might end up uploading files, they might end up uploading spreadsheets, and you want to store them somewhere. Well, you can end up uploading them and store them on S3. You don't need S3 to do that. You could fairly easily store files, encode your files, and store them up in a database. You could do that. You could store files on a drive where your site is hosted. That's a little bit complicated because one of the things we know about Node is that we want to be able to scale things horizontally. So actually assuming that things are going to be on some file system for all your different Node processes is a little bit tricky. Databases would be a little bit easier to do, but then you're in charge of managing those files, okay? Something happens to your database, those files are gone. One of the things that you end up getting with S3 is that there is very fine-grained permissioning you can end up using. So not only is it a file system, but you could say, hey, look, even though this file is there, I'm not going to allow you to access it. You've got to be a specific user to end up accessing these files. So it can get very complex in terms of, so another way to say that is that it gives you the ability to securely store and upload files. So I'm logged in here to AWS, and these are the services that I've used recently. And when you think about AWS, you don't think in terms of folders, you think in terms of buckets, okay? So buckets are like folders, and we might think that this is stored in some file system, but even a file system, right, this is basically just made up of bits that are stored somewhere. However they're stored, but we can organize our data up on S3 with buckets. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go and I'll create a bucket here. I'm going to call this profs demo bucket. Okay. These things could get fairly complex in terms of how you end up permissioning them. And there's I'm not going to, I wouldn't even really know what to do here, but there's all kinds of complexity you could do in terms of, we're seeing here saving versioning or that sort of things here. One thing that I'm going to do here is by default, everything's sort of blocked off from public access. So, and again, this is granular. So even though you could say that a bucket is accessible to the public, doesn't mean that what you end up putting in the bucket is going to end up being accessible. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to allow this bucket to be accessed publicly, and I'm going to end up creating the bucket, right? So this is the bucket that I just ended up creating, and there's nothing in it. Now, the next thing that I want to do goes into something that I mentioned before. I'm going to create a file that I'm going to end up uploading to this bucket. I'm going to just dynamically generate a file with a random name and a random string inside it. I'm going to put a string inside of an H1 tag. And so I'm going to go over here. Let me just touch app.js. I'm going to do nodemon app.js. And I'm going to end up opening up this over here. And what I'm sort of getting at here is that I'm going to start out by just every time that this runs, I'm going to create a file name. And so I'm going to say, well, here's a random number, math.random. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, I'm going to call this key for a reason I'll talk about a little bit later on. So here, we're going to call this file, and I'm going to say that this is going to be my key.html. Let's just log it. So this is random, thank you. Wait, hold on. Key is going to be, this is correct, right, random, thank you. Right, this is going to be a random file. And for the contents of this file, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to have an H1 tag, and I'm going to put in the same random number. And let's just log the contents. Okay. So what I want to do here is I want to talk about a library. We've used the FS library. And if we wanted to create a file, what we'd have to do is we would have to say fs write file, and we could put in the name of our file, which is going to be our key, and we'd have to put a callback function in here to see if we end up getting an error, that sort of thing, right? Well, this is a little bit of a drag, right? Whenever you're dealing with a library that has these callback functions, it's a bit of a drag to use. And there's a library that's pretty commonly used called the Bluebird library. You know why it's called Bluebird? And I'm going to pull in a function from the Bluebird library called promisifyAll. What I'm going to end up doing here now, I don't have this library. This is going to die. Let me install it. Okay. And what I want to show you is that what's kind of interesting about this is I could say, hey, look, promisifyAll FS. What this is going to end up doing is that it's going to add methods to the FS object that are permissified. It's going to actually look at the signatures of the functions in FS, and it's going to look at those signatures, and it's going to figure out functions that have callbacks in them, and it's going to permissify them. You could do this on your own. If you wanted to permissify read file, it would be 3 lines to do, but this just makes our life a lot easier, where what we could do is that all the methods that we had before, fs write file will now have a method called fs write file async. The name of our file here is going to be our key. Our contents is going to be our contents. That's how we do fs write file. And the beauty of this is that we're going to be able to put a then here. And also a catch. And we end up getting done. And we've got a new file every time that this runs. Just to show you something, if I take this out, I'll see that read file, write file async doesn't end up existing, okay? So this basically goes in, looks at the functions that are in there, figures out what can end up being permissified, what can end up being permissified, makes your life a lot easier. Very common library to use. If you start doing anything with callbacks that is anything substantial, it could drive you a little bit crazy after a while. So I want to do one other thing here. What I want to do is sort of fake what we might have in a system where we might be actually reading a file. So not only am I going to end up writing the file, what I'll do here is I'm going to go over here, and on one line, I'm just going to say fs read file. Hey, look, you wrote it. Now read it. What's the file? Well, the file is going to be this key. I'm going to have some data, and I'm going to console.log the data. Read file async, right? I want to do it asynchronously as a promise, okay? What I end up getting back here is a bunch of bytes. The file is just made up of a bunch of bytes. If I wanted to, I could turn this into a string. And I'll end up getting my h1 tag here. But I'm just going to leave it right now as bytes. Now, what I'm going to do here, now I've got this file. I've got a couple of files to work with. So I'm just going to go over here. So now I've got these files. So now let's go back to AWS, and I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to upload a file. And I'm going to end up adding a file, and I'm going to go into my demo, and I'm going to take one of these files, and I'm going to upload it. All right? Now, this file is on AWS, and I'm going to attempt to access this file, okay? This would be, I uploaded it, it's in the cloud, the file is up there, it's nice and safe on AWS. I'm going to take this file, I'm going to attempt to open it. Okay? By default, access is denied. So the default behavior in AWS, even though the bucket is readable, the file itself, if I went back over here and I look at this file, and I want to show you two things about this file. I want to, first of all, look at the properties. And if I look at the metadata for this file, it tells me, it figured it out when I uploaded it, that it was an HTML file. So the metadata says it's text.html. But if I go over here and I look at permissions, right, it doesn't have any access to read the file. So I'm going to go and say, just to keep it simple, I'm going to say everybody can read this file. And I'm going to click on save. All right? Now I'm going to go back here. I'm going to go and attempt to open up this file. And I could end up seeing that file. Okay? So here we're looking at, hey, AWS stores files. There's a URL that we could end up reading the files. Now, when we have users use our application, right, we're not going to make them go to AWS and give them permissions to go to AWS. They're going to be uploading data from within our application. So how can we upload data to AWS? Well, one of the things that AWS has is they have a the ability to access endpoints of AWS with the correct credentials and dynamically use an API to interact with your bucket, okay? You can create buckets, you could delete buckets, you could iterate over buckets. Anything you can do in the UI, you can end up doing through the API. What we're going to do is we're going to end up uploading a file to a bucket. So there's a library written in Node called the AWS SDK, AWS Software Development Kit, I assume, right? So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to this code, and I'm going to bring in AWS Require Aws Sdk. Okay. Again, when I go to do that here, it'll say it doesn't have it. Let's go over here, npm install AWS SDK. npm I and we'll go back over here, and this will end up running okay. Now, what I'm going to attempt to do here is I want to basically programmatically access my S3 bucket. So I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to say S3, this is my S3 bucket, and I'm going to say, hey, look, new AWS S3. And what I'm going to attempt to do is I'm going to end up attempting to load this up to AWS. Okay? Unfortunately, AWS methods also put you in the callback hell category, but they actually have something that will allow us to use promises in a slightly different way. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to say S3, I want you to put an object, okay? Now, I ended up naming my bucket here, right? So I don't have to end up changing this. This is going to be profs demo bucket. I'm going to say bucket, profs demo bucket. And I'm going to go over here, and this ends up taking an object. In fact, if you go over here and look at this file here, you'll see that this file name is actually the key. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say to AWS, hey, AWS, I want you to use this bucket. This is the key. And when you end up uploading it to AWS, there's probably other ways to do this, but AWS does very well with basically buffers of data. And that's what we have here. These results are a buffer of data. And again, you can get this from the documentation. This is going to end up going in the body. Okay? So, in fact, just to make my life a little bit easier here, I'm going to call this body. This ends up, one of the things I could do with this is I could take this, I'm going to assign it a value. And this, by default, by the way, this takes a callback function. The callback function is going to either get an error or a result. I don't want to deal with that. It's gets to be a little bit too much work. But one of the things I could do with AWS is I could say, hey, look, just give me the promise for this. And I'm going to go over here. And from in here, I'm going to return this promise. Okay? And let's just take a look and let's see what happens here. Come on, don't disappoint me here. So I end up getting a problem here because you can't just go in and access someone's AWS bucket, okay? Now, AWS has some things by default where what you could end up doing, and I'm going to copy this and paste it here for a sec. This is not going to quite work, but I'm going to go up here. And again, this is not something that you would end up putting in your repo. But one of the things we could get from AWS is we're going to get a key pair. Okay? This allows my application to talk to AWS, and both my app and AWS end up knowing this private key. Okay? This is a way of encrypting data that goes back and forth. So AWS knows that I'm trusted, right? And I know what I end up getting back from AWS is trusted as well. Okay? This is public-private key cryptography, which what I know about that I could put on the back of a stamp, which means one of you is going to ask what's public-private key cryptography, and I'm going to say what I know about it is on the back of the stamp, and we'll get into a little bit of an infinite loop here. So these, by the way, these keys are not valid. If I go to run this again, I'm going to end up getting, well, a little bit of a different message. This key doesn't exist. Well, one of the things that AWS has is they have another area which allows you to basically set up security of users. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go and I'm going to set up a user, and I'm going to give this user the ability to access my S3 buckets. So I'm going to create this user. I'm going to call this profs demo user. And I just want to give them programmatic access. Okay? This is just from my app to talk to AWS. And I'm going to click on next here. And I already have set this up for AWS to get full permissions. You could search for permissions here. But this is going to give them these S3 permissions, and I'm going to click on next. It asks about tags. I'm not sure what that is. It says there's a preview here, and I'm going to create this user. This is the only time that I will get access to these values, this secret key and this access key. I could download the key. If I want to download it, it'll end up letting me do this. But I'm just going to copy these values. I'm going to take this value. This is going to be my access key. And I'm going to go up here. Move this over. And again, these are AWS by default. The AWS SDK looks for these access keys. Okay. These are things that you could configure differently if you want to. This is just a default. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to grab this secret key. Okay? I don't see any error. Now, if I go over here and I look over here, hold on. Let me go back here, and I'm going to go back to my S3 service. And I'm going to go into this bucket that I have. And I'll see these two files. Okay? By the way, every time that I run this program, I'll end up seeing another file here. Okay? One of the things I could do is, assuming this ends up getting uploaded correctly, I'm going to generate the URL for this. The URL for this is going to be HTTPS, whatever the name of my bucket is. And I always forget what this is. I always have to look at these. This is S3 Amazon AWS.com. And this is going to be the name of my key. So let's just log that URL. So now we've got this URL, and I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to say, great, I've got this URL. Let me try to access this file. and I'll get that message that I had before, okay? Not surprisingly, because by default, you can't end up accessing this file, okay? So what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna modify this with another key value, and this is gonna be public read. I'm gonna make this readable, okay? I'm gonna go and run this again. We get another file. Go over here, put this in, okay? Notice the file downloaded, okay? The file downloaded, I could end up opening up this file, okay? But I couldn't open it up from the URL. It downloaded, okay? The reason why that happened is that when I upload something through the UI, when I end up uploading something from the UI, it realizes that it's a text.html file. If I go and I look at, and let's make sure I pick out the right one here. Let's do the 051 here. Let's refresh. There's this 0512. If I go over here and I look at these properties and I look at the metadata, I'll see that it's just treating it as a stream of data, okay? Now again, if I upload the file, I know what the extension is of the file, I know the type of the file. So the last thing I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna go over here and I'm gonna say that the content type is gonna be text HTML. I'm gonna try this again. And now when I go and do this, I'm gonna go over here and I'll be able to access that file, okay? So again, few lines of code, fair amount of configuration you could upload. Great, we know we can do that, okay? What if we had a bucket and we want to find out what's inside the bucket? So we started out, and again, it sort of makes sense, you know, if you don't have anything in the bucket, you can't read anything from the bucket. What I'm gonna do here, I'm gonna comment all this out. And I'm gonna go over here. And I am going to go over here and I'm going to say, hey, look, S3, list objects, okay? Where do you want to list objects from? Well, I've got to give this a bucket, okay? Now, again, I could do this with a callback, okay? I could get this to work with a callback. I could either get error or results. Console log error, console log results. And if I go over here, I'll see all those files that are in my bucket, okay? I don't get the files, I actually get, truncated means, hey, look, there was, I think it gives you a max of like 100 files. So if you really were managing this, you'd have to know, are they all the files that are on the list, right? And it gives me some information about these files. It gives me everything that I need to have, right? I know the bucket, I know the key, I can end up accessing the file. But just to show you that you don't have to necessarily use callbacks. By the way, what would happen here if I did this, right? Then I end up getting this error message, access denied, right? Because that bucket doesn't exist. So we'll switch this back. And the only thing I'm going to do here is instead of actually calling this directly, I'm going to get rid of my callback and just right in line, I'm going to grab its promise, which now gives me the ability to do a then results console.log results. And I'm really at the same position that I was before, right? If there was an error here, I could end up catching that. By going up here. And now I'll end up seeing this error. Okay. So again, real quick look at being able to interact with AWS too. By the way, you might ask the question, why didn't I permissify all on the S3? And I actually tried that, but it said there were some async methods that were already there, and permissify all wouldn't end up working. But again, this is a way that you don't have to deal with really what is gets incredibly frustrating. Once you go one level deep into callbacks, it gets to be a real drag. That's really about it. Let me just stop this real quick. Thank you for the applause, everybody. I appreciate it.